Good day, everybody. This is Brian Kittler with the Pinchot Institute for Conservation. And with me today is Maureen McDonough with Michigan State University. We're going to be talking about a new report that is just live on our website now. It's case studies on public engagement and stewardship contracts and agreements. And really, we're going to focus on, in the next hour, some lessons that we've drawn from these projects. And I will just note that there's 15 projects that we looked at this year, and that adds to 45 in the last few years. So there's 60 projects, 60 recent case studies across the country that you can peruse if you're interested. So just real quick, with our agenda this morning, we're going to do a quick intro poll as people sign on. And then we're going to walk through the basics of stewardship contracting for those less familiar with the tool. We're going to review our case study methodology. We'll then talk about our results from a few sample example projects. We'll conclude with an exit poll and hopefully have time for some question and answers. All right.
All right. So this is Maureen. Welcome, everyone. So we're going to do a brief intro poll just to see who's out there. So we'll do these one at a time, questions one at a time. And so if you could answer this question, please, and then we'll look at the answers. So in what region do you work most often? Okay, so here's the results. Here's who's on the line so far. Majority of people are from the Pacific Coast region, followed by the Lake States, followed by the Central Rockies, and with a few from the Southeast and the Northern Rockies. Next question. So if you could please select one of these, which most accurately defines your affiliation with respect to your interest in stewardship contracting. Please pick one. Okay, so 67% are from our Forest Service folks, and then followed by nonprofits, and then other agencies, which we'll be talking about partnerships later, and then a few from the private sector. Next question. How many stewardship contracts or agreements have you been a part of? So these results actually reflect the results from the people that we interviewed as well, in which there are people that are very, very experienced to people that this is their first, the project they're engaged in now is their first experience with stewardship contracting. So why are you interested in stewardship contracting? And you can pick as many as apply here. Okay, so 84% say achieve specific outcomes on the ground and 78% to get work done on the ground, which really reflects the input that the results of these case studies, the previous years of case studies, and all the years that we did surveys instead of case studies with participants. So most participants in stewardship contracting want to see specific outcomes on the ground. And finally, the final intro poll question is, with respect to Forest Service projects, which are you? Select all that apply. So about half are Forest Service staff who are responding to public input around Forest Service projects, but 43% are members of collaborative groups, and 37% are involved in the collaborative process, but not in a formal group. Brian, you're up.
Great. So just starting off here, for those less familiar with stewardship contracting, we've got a couple introduction slides. The Forest Service manages over 190 million acres of federal forest and grasslands, 193 to be exact. And over the last decade, stewardship contracting has become a very important tool for natural resource management and ecosystem restoration on these forests. In fact, it's now accounting for about 25 to 30% of the vegetative management projects on the national forests, and that's by timber volume. So 25 to 30% of the volume produced is coming through stewardship contracts. An important implementation mechanism. It's a high profile in many projects. We're seeing increasing money going into Joint Chiefs. The CFLR program has been ongoing for a number of years, and a lot of the work being done in those projects through stewardship agreements and contracts. And as we'll talk about today, there's a few instances also where those larger efforts, those larger collaborative regional efforts, have spun off other projects and agreements underneath them. Stewardship is really focused on multiple use management and integrated restoration. So most often we see projects that include road and trail maintenance or obliteration, maintenance of soil productivity, habitat and fisheries management, prescribed fire, restoration, watershed management, vegetative removal, and control of invasive plants. In fact, those are all the authorized activities under stewardship authorities. And specifically, those authorities include best value contracting, which requires consideration of other criteria in addition to cost. So typically, the agency will look at prior performance of a contractor, their skills, whether or not they're a local business and provide local benefit to the community. Also, another authority is multi-year contracting. So stewardship can go up to 10 years in length. A lot of the larger projects tend to be multiple years in length. And also the stewardship agreements tend to be 10 years in length. Designation by prescription. And this specifies in the contract the desired end result of the project, which gives the contractor some flexibility in how they achieve the results, versus designation by description, which specifically allows for the contractor to not have to physically mark every tree when they go into a treatment area. And agreement authorities, so the Forest Service and the BLM for that matter, can enter into agreements with local communities, local governments, nonprofits, without the use of competing with the project as they would under a stewardship contract. Trading for goods and services. This is the authority that people typically think about, or one of the authorities that people typically think about when they think of stewardship contracting. And really its ability to apply the value of timber of the forest products that are removed during a project against the cost of services received. So you could be doing projects that are a net cost to the agency, and the agency can use a trade-off of the value of timber to pay for some of that work. Similarly, retention of receipts, it's the ability to keep revenues or timber receipts generated by a project when the produced value exceeds the service work performed within that project or in another project in the future. And lastly, widening the range of eligible contractors. So again, this typically goes with agreements, so working with nonprofits, local governmental bodies, etc. So over time, as we've seen, and this chart basically shows the last decade plus, the number of projects, the acres awarded, and the timber volume awarded. We've seen a steady growth and a leveling off in the last few years in terms of the acres awarded, and also in the timber volume awarded, although I will note that 2017 was the largest year for stewardship in terms of timber volume. And while I said earlier that 25 to 30% of the volume is produced through stewardship authorities, the value of the timber that's produced is typically low. So the average annual value of timber produced in stewardship contracts between 2010 and 2016 was around $23 million, just shy of $23 million nationally. That's sort of the annual average there. Whereas during that same time frame, timber sales produced an annual average of over 216 million. So I think that's an indication that the tool is being used as appropriate in places where timber is a part of the project. It's not typically not the only thing. The commercial aspects of the project are not the only thing people are interested in. Okay.
All right. So communities and community benefits have always been very important in stewardship contracting, hence the programmatic monitoring around the role of communities in stewardship contracting and stewardship agreements. And this goes all the way back to the very beginning of the original pilots. At the beginning, in the early projects, the pilots in particular, but even projects after that, the communities, which we think about as people living in or near a national forest, were the driving force in many of these projects, including local residents, local officials, local chambers of commerce, but very much local people living in or around the forest. But as the use of these authorities has expanded over the years, so has the range of participants. And I need to say the use has expanded in very creative ways. I think you'll see from the 5 projects that we're going to highlight today, and if you go to the report, that the application of the authorities is very, very creative and very different in application across national forests. And so the range of participants has expanded as well. And so local community involvement in these projects occurs in a wide range of ways along a spectrum, from formal collaboratives, which is what some may think of, to NGOs, to intergovernmental relations between agencies like other federal agencies, state agencies, tribal involvement, local government. So there's this quite wide range of participants now that there weren't much wider than at the beginning. And just as a reminder, the Forest Service Handbook says that collaboration must be a part of stewardship contract project planning and continue through the life of the project. So kind of keep that in the back of your mind as we go through the results from this year's case studies. Okay. So it's the programmatic monitoring piece, looking at the engagement of communities, and now we say other non-agency stakeholders, because it's not just local communities. The Farm Bill, the Forest Service is required to monitor the role of communities in stewardship contracting. And for those of you who've been around this a while, you know that we used to do surveys to do this monitoring. We've done the case studies. Started doing case studies in 2014, and soon we'll share with you what those criteria are, but it's how we get representation of projects. And we now have 60 case studies, as Brian said, of stewardship agreements and contracts that were active between 2011 and 2016. And you can, if you need something to read, you can go back to the Pinchot website and read all of them. So there are 5 overarching questions that the Forest Service is interested in and were developed in conjunction with Pinchot Institute and the Forest Service. And here they are. The first one is looking at the engagement of non-agency stakeholders across the life of the project. The second question really looks at has participation in these projects changed relationships between agency and non-agency stakeholders? The third question focuses on where engagement is most important. What stages of engagement are most important, most impactful, and are the participants satisfied with the level of engagement around those what they feel are the most important kinds of engagement? The fourth question looks at the diversity of participation, because as you will shortly see, participation is really quite diverse across these projects. And is that diversity related to whether people think projects are successful or not? And finally, has the involvement of non-agency stakeholders influenced scale, meaning size, and scope, meaning complexity of stewardship projects? So the methods, there were 15 projects were selected, and from projects that were started between 2013 and 2016. So they're fairly recent projects. The selection criteria are these 4 items. We wanted the projects to be geographically distributed across 5 regions. We wanted to have small projects, less than 1,000 acres, and large projects. We wanted to have a good mix of agreements and contracts, and we wanted to have a good mix of projects that had a standing collaborative group, a more formal collaborative group, or no existing collaborative group. We used a snowball sampling technique, which for those of you that aren't familiar with snowball sampling, it's like a snowball rolling down a hill, very appropriate. I'm in Michigan, and we have a lot of snow right now, but the whole idea is that you start with one person or one flake, and as you roll along, you get more and more and more names. So in this project, we started with the agency contact, and we asked for names and contact information for primary stakeholders. We also have data on secondary stakeholders or other people that were involved, but we were interested in interviewing primary stakeholders. Then as we contacted those folks, we asked them to affirm the names that the agency person gave us and add any additional names. And we kept doing that until we were coming back around and getting the same names over and over. We did 2 to 9 interviews per project. Some projects have a lot more people engaged than others, and so they had more interviews. There were 65 interviews this year, 17 Forest Service and 48 non-agency. Generally, we interview 1 Forest Service person per project. In this year, we had 2 projects in which 2 Forest Service people were on the line at once. So there were 17 involved, and we didn't ask those 5 questions as they were written. Those are the overarching questions. We developed an interview protocol based on those 5 questions. And once we have the interviews were audio taped, transcribed, and then we did a qualitative analysis. We did not use software. There aren't enough projects here to make software worthwhile. But we did, because we had 2 coders, 2 raters, Brian and I, we were able to account for inter-rater reliability in the qualitative analysis. Brian. Oh, results. All right, so Brian's going to go through the results, focus on the 5 overarching questions. Remember that these results are based on these 15 case studies and 65 interviews this year, as opposed to generalizing to all stewardship contracting projects. Okay, Brian.
Okay. So just starting off, as Maureen alluded to, we typically, when we're starting this process, we break the country up into multiple state regions. So starting in the Southwest and Central Rockies, We have an agreement on the Cibola National Forest. It's over 1,000 acres, and there's a collaborative group present. It has a very interesting set of actors, and they're doing a lot of work around supporting restarting a local industry to facilitate restoration. We have a very large integrated resource service contract on a multiple forest in Arizona. It's a long collaborative process in developing consensus planning and visioning around defining that landscape for multiple contracts, one of which we looked at was this IRSC. And then we have the Uncompahgre, which was a stewardship agreement. Again, this was right around 1,000 acres, and it did have a collaborative group associated with it. In the Pacific Coast region, we had an integrated resource timber contract paired with an agreement on the Deschutes National Forest. It was relatively small, and it did have a collaborative process tied to it. On the Fremont and Wainema National Forest, we looked at an agreement. It was a large project, and there was no formal collaborative group around it, but it was an instance where the partners engaged, including the Forest Service, had all been working together over a couple decades in defining what they wanted to see on the landscape. So this was an instance where individuals had tight collaborative relationships. And then finally, the Tahoe National Forest, we looked at an IRTC. It's a larger project, and it does have a collaborative planning and design element to it with multiple partners, very diverse set of actors coming together. In the Northern Rockies, we looked at 3 integrated resource timber contracts. They varied in size. 2 of which had collaborative groups, one in the Idaho Panhandle National Forest and one on the Bitterroot National Forest, and one of which did not on the Gallatin National Forest. In the Northeast, on the Allegheny, we looked at a small IRTC, did not have a collaborative group process associated with it, and it was basically just the agency and contractors involved in it. It was very much internally planned by the agency. On the Green Mountain National Forest, we looked into an IRTC paired with a stewardship agreement. There were a number of stakeholders engaged, multiple objective project, multiple resource project, significant recreation component, and there was no real collaborative process around it. A lot of the planning work included public engagement, but it was more traditional. And then on the Chemalgrin-Nicolet National Forest, we looked at a small stewardship agreement. Did not have a collaborative group, but again, it was collaborative relationships between individuals that had worked together for quite a while and had, already starting with a collegial relationship going into it. It was then transitioning that into an implementation relationship. In the South, we looked at a mix of projects, a couple IRTCs and agreements, both without collaborative groups, but with collaborative relationships, one on the Kisatchie in Louisiana and one on the DeSoto in Mississippi. And then on the National Forest in Florida, on the Osceola, we looked at a larger agreement that very much had a collaborative group tied to it. So answers to the 5 questions. So how are non-agency stakeholders engaged in the development and implementation of projects? So in answering this question, we first ask respondents to define what role stakeholders play. And so this word cloud, it depicts basically the roles that non-agency stakeholder participants cite in their interviews. And the larger the words or phrases, the more often they were cited. So we see a clear kind of breakdown here between collaborative planning, performance monitoring, implementation, and facilitation as being very much a strong, consistent role in a lot of these projects. And when we talk about the projects a little bit more, you'll kind of see how that breakout occurs. And we also see more technical aspects from project management, subcontracting, NEPA scoping, sale administration, effects monitoring, business analysis. Those are things that partners are providing as far as technical expertise that the agency is either turning to them or that the partners are just bringing into the projects of their own volition. And we also see some aspects in here in a couple projects that were pretty critical to making projects happen. So funding was a biggie, a lot in the agreements, but in some of the contracts as well, external funding coming in. And then also advocating politically for a project to happen. That happened in a couple. So after we asked about what role stakeholders play, we asked them about sort of what phases they engage in projects. And what you see here is we've broken up the projects, the 15 projects, by projects with collaboratives and projects without collaboratives. And then we see a relationship between, for instance, the projects with formal collaboratives and extensive engagement by non-agency stakeholders in the planning process, oftentimes as part of a CFLR project, and then also in monitoring. And I tend to think those things are pretty well linked together. I will note that when we did look at a number of agreements this year, both of them, we observed that those agreements included, they were basically split between having no formal collaborative group and those that did actually have a collaborative group associated with them. One thing to note here, that item of individuals engaging as technical experts, I'm not saying, this doesn't say that, for instance, you shouldn't interpret this as saying that in formal collaborative projects that individuals are not bringing in technical expertise. It's just how they're identifying themselves. So they're not saying, you know, we were brought in because we have technical expertise. What they're saying is we participated in planning, and as that, we were providing expertise. So second question, have relationships between agency and non-agency stakeholders changed due to involvement in projects? So by and large, we see that respondents generally feel like relationships had changed, and those citing improved relationships suggest they are due to people working more closely together over time. And where relationships are strong, it's often due to multiple years of collaborative work, and many acknowledge throughout these interviews that the investment of time required to get there is oftentimes very much a challenge. And people also describe this evolution over time rather than being owned to any one single project. Consistency in staffing was cited in 3 projects as key to allowing working relationships to develop and projects to move forward. In one case where relationships degraded, poor communication between contracting officer and the agency personnel working on the front line with partners really led to a breach of trust and degrading of the social capital that had been built up in that place over time. So we'll talk more about that. It's one of the examples we're going to walk through. I will note too that in terms of trust, there's a good quote here from one agency employee where they're reflecting on engagement. They say, you know, it's not the first meeting, but the 12th meeting that you have built that trust. And, you know, besides the time it takes, it's also personnel and personal attributes that help as well. So listening skills, a willingness and ability, both share information with external parties and receive and integrate data into planning, that is integral to a lot of these projects. And we observe that some people are just capable of doing that better than others. Okay, so question 3. What project phases do partners feel are most important for non-agency stakeholder involvement? And are participants satisfied with the level of engagement? So this is pretty much universally every year that we've looked at stewardship contracting. It's always people are most, they feel their most valuable engagement occurs at the very early phases of projects. So right at the conceptual underpinnings of an idea. People want to be involved early. And others specify, you know, some discrete aspect of their involvement as being most important, such as providing scientific data or technical expertise for improving on project designs, monitoring conditions post-treatment, or monitoring T&E species, and facilitating collaborative processes.
Brian, can I make a comment?
Yep.
So Brian alluded to this in the answers to the last question, and I just want to stress it because you'll see in at least one, if not more, of the cases we're going to present as examples. This providing capacity or technical expertise that participants felt they brought to the table. The other part of that is the ability of agency folks, the willingness of agency folks to accept that outside technical expertise and incorporate it. So kind of keep that in mind as we look through the examples.
And so by and large, in terms of how people feel about their level of engagement, do they feel like they were bought in at the right time? People generally feel, yeah, they are satisfied with how they've been engaged. In the few instances where they reported not being satisfied, it was because they perceived a breach of trust or that they felt like they weren't involved early enough. Okay, so question 4. So how does the diversity of participants relate to perceptions of success? So first off, by and large, people do feel that these projects are successful. In the few instances where they do not feel that way, participants viewed projects as unsuccessful because they were primarily unsatisfied with either the slow rate of progress or with the quality of implementation. So it's not like they felt like things weren't going well. Although I will say that in one project it was a bit of a failure overall. All right, so non-agency participation occurs along that spectrum that we talked about, and I'm willing to break it down into four project types when we look at this. I mean, we could break this up, split it up any possible way, but the first one being, with at least 3 projects that we looked at, there was these infrequent or passive forms of engagement and participation, sort of less established relationships with the agency and between the agency and non-agency participants. And in these projects, the agency came up with the idea internally, planned the project, sent out a scoping notification of proposed actions, held public meetings, and received and reviewed comments on NEPA. It's a very sort of traditional way of looking at it. Another type is formative collaborative relationships. In 4 cases, we viewed these formative collaborative relationships whereby a small number of individuals come together, and oftentimes it was really the first time that they came together. It was around sort of planning some area of mutual interest. So a lot of the agreements kind of fall into this bucket. A third one is a collaboration with a few strong, well-established relationships. I think there's 3 or 4 projects that we looked at this year where it was really, 3 or 4 people that had worked together for years and had existing relationships, and they transitioned that into implementation. And then the 4th type, I would say, is these more kind of large formal collaborative planning processes. So a lot of the CFLR projects that we looked at, I think really fall into that bucket. But the real point here that relates back to question 4 is that across that spectrum of all these different project types and all these different interactions, success is viewed through the lens of the individual's role. And so people are generally they're willing to say a project is successful if they feel like they were engaged well, if they feel satisfied with the process. And I say that because these are all very recent projects, and really none of the longer term outcomes that people come to the table to see happen are actually, they haven't either been measured or they've yet to occur. And again, we talked about the 2 projects where people felt things were unsuccessful. Okay, so 5th question. Is the involvement of non-agency stakeholders, including local communities and tribes, influencing the scope and scale of stewardship projects? So first, in these case studies, respondents are generally split on whether non-agency stakeholders influence the size of projects. In projects where participants felt the size was not changed, they communicated to us varied reasons for this, and specifically that the size is really influenced mostly by a special use permittee in one instance, or that the boundary of the project was influenced by ecological boundaries. It was, focused on one particular watershed. So instances where the size of projects increased, though, stakeholders, it could be because stakeholders advocated for growing the project to a larger scale. That happened in a number of projects. In one instance, a stakeholder reported that they would not engage unless the agency committed to a larger scale. And that was in a very formal agreement. That kind of was the terms that weren't in the agreement itself, but were the basis for entering into agreement. Another instance where reason why projects increase in size that we observe, it really comes down to the structure of projects. So in a number of instances, non-agency stakeholders and participants are dramatically increasing the capacity and ability of the agency to get work done. So that's the reason why the projects grow in size, because they're able to leverage resources and funding just to get more work done. And in a few instances, we saw the timber component of, say, an IRTC paired with an agreement actually growing. And that is because the partners in the agreement, the parties to the agreement, came up with new ideas for new projects, and they were looking for ways to get it done. And then they planned a timber project to help fund some of that work. And we'll talk about one of those specific projects. So reasons why projects decrease in size. In these case studies, it was to fit a NEPA categorical exclusion policy requirement. The project was parsed back due to sensitive areas and where people couldn't come to agreement, due to agency capacity limitations, and to keep a project manageable, keep it small for an agreement holder. It was a new project. It was a new agreement holder. They had never really done stewardship before. So those are all factors on why projects increase in size and decrease in size. In terms of project scope, majority of participants in case studies that we looked at this year identified their project becoming more complex, and often it's due to the involvement of non-agency stakeholders, and then also due to the complexity of the design elements that people want to see happen in these projects. So projects are more complex because you're managing more relationships, and they're more complex because people want to see more complex work done on the ground. Okay, so now we're going to transition to talking about 5 specific cases. I will note that we did look at 15 really interesting projects this year, equally interesting to the ones that I'm going to talk about. So I would really encourage you to take a look at the report, and specifically the second half of the report, which dives into the individual project description. So the first one is on the Oncompagre National Forest. It's a very implementation-focused stewardship agreement with a nonprofit. The nonprofit didn't actually participate in the NEPA process. They just came in as an implementer. It's forest health project. It's also focused on big game habitat, thinning out overstocked juniper stands, as well as commercial ponderosa pine. So in this project, the agreement holder oversees the sale administration. They track the progress. They bring in external funding to help fund some of the service activities. And it's really their expertise and long track record with stewardship that made the difference in this project. So the agreement holder had done over 20 stewardship contracts and agreements prior to this, and the agency lead had done 0. And the agency lead was also new to the district ranger position. So it was their willingness to reach out to partners and say, I don't know how we're going to get this work done. you guys seem like you're doing some really good work in the region. Let's see if we can partner. And that conversation led to 3 nonprofits basically training up agency staff on stewardship agreements more generally. And then that set of conversations and trainings led to a more strategic conversation about designing some projects. So that's where this whole thing came out of. And specifically, I'll quote the district ranger here who said, quote, "No one had done it, so no one had taken trainings to be qualified. I had to work with my grants and agreements person on the forest, and she never had dealt with timber harvest and massification work and all that. So she had to learn that part of it, and then the agreement protocols. Because no one was qualified in the region to sign it, to move it forward, it was very challenging." So while that person is stating that it was challenging, they obviously were able to make it happen and move it forward. And it's a pretty inspiring example. I would say the last real takeaway and lesson from this project was that sort of the open communications and information exchange between all these partners, it became apparent to the agreement holder that it was really the agency's own limitations in their capacity that was limiting the amount of timber that they were putting up. So I'll quote the agreement holder here, and where they say, one of the things that we learned from the beginning was that they were hampered with time in setting up timber sales. So we had the ability to actually go out and get a contractor 2 separate years to help them in initiating, marking, and laying out timber sales. And it wasn't specific to us getting part of those timber sales back in through the agreement. It was just the ability for us to work with the Forest Service and help them increase their capacity to get work done. So basically what they're saying there is that, they were able to do a lot of the prep work, the upfront work, and it wasn't necessarily even specific to the timber work that they were doing on their agreement. So great outcome all around. Second project that I'll talk about is on the Tahoe. This was a 1,500-acre integrated resource timber contract paired with an agreement with Sierras. It's a very complex set of ecological issues in that region, and the project is focused on implementing basically a showcase for the region and how you can do complex silviculture, reducing fire severity as well as improve old forest habitat. It's sort of the thing that everyone in the region wanted to see happen, but no one had taken on to that point in time. The project originally was designed as a very straightforward, simple fuels project, and then over time, stakeholders, a number of different parties came in over a decade with different ideas about how the project could be implemented, how it could be, how it could evolve. So while it's relatively small in size, their aspiration was that the project would have a much larger impact. And going into that, all these parts, they reflected to us that it took a lot longer, it cost a lot more money, but that they feel that they're going to see better results from the project at the end of the day, even though major components have yet to be completed. So just a quote from the Forest Service lead on this project here, they said, when we asked them whether about non-agency involvement, they said, absolutely it affected the complexity, but in a good way. I moaned and groaned when I entered the collaboration process, but at the same time, I think the result was much better. So for them, it worked out. Another factor here in this project was that everybody had transparent access to the data and the science. And a lot of the partners engaged in this project were scientists by training or considered themselves versed enough in science that it made for a real focus of the project. So the fact that everyone had this transparent access to a common set of knowledge took away a lot of the arguments that can sometimes come into projects like this about, you're using your data and that's not right, or my data is better than your data. So that didn't happen here. Another element here was that there was a facilitator in this project. It was not an impartial facilitator. They were from a watershed group in the region that everybody worked with and respected, but they did want to see work done on the ground. So I just make a note of that. So it wasn't like they were a totally impartial facilitator. And the last couple items here, in this project, the process that was used led to the non-agency stakeholders gaining a better understanding of agency procedures and the NEPA process more completely. And think about this, they were working together over a 13-year period. That is bound to happen. But I find it, a good example because you have an instance where an environmental group who rarely previously engaged in a collaborative process with the Forest Service before came to the table, and they were able to influence the design of the treatments by working directly with the agency and with agency scientists and other university scientists and others throughout the region. And that environmental group ended up proving to be integral into the design of the project and ended up raising funds to help implement the project. So it's a sort of an interesting turn on that, where you have all these former opponents coming together to hash things out and get a project implemented on the ground. The next project here on the Gallatin, this was a small IRTC project. They kept it small to be able to use the categorical exclusion. They had a long history of basically every project being litigated on the forest, and they felt like a CE could help them. The project was focused on reducing fuels and improving forest health in a widely used recreation area. Interested community members were engaged, not in sort of a formal collaborative process, but in a series of public meetings, basically to hear from the agency what the proposed actions were going to be. And there was an opportunity here for the agency, for the non-agency stakeholders to respond, and most of them, which had a direct stake in the management of this area because they were either outfitters or coordinators of the trail network, that sort of thing, they did express concerns. They were concerned about visual impacts, and they were mostly concerned about the surface of the ski trails. So the project had proposed to use the surface of the ski trails as the skid roads, and that ended up coming back to haunt the project in the end. I'll talk some more about that. So at these public meetings, the agency lead at the time and the community agreed to some basic design elements, some extended buffers along the ski trails to help prevent snowdrift coming onto the groomed areas, and sort of the immediate repair of the skid trails following the project, and how slash would be treated. Unfortunately, though, those communications and that general agreement kind of didn't make its way into the NEPA alternatives. And at the time, there was some staff transitions within the agency. The lead that had been working with the community moved on, and what was agreed to was not reinforced in the NEPA. And during the NEPA comments, the stakeholders in the community did express support for the project, but they did not reinforce what was discussed earlier and what was agreed to in their minds. So none of them had a long-term relationship with the Forest Service in the sense of implementation and what goes into NEPA. So they didn't really have that background, and there was no one from the agency there to really kind of walk them through that. So when the new agency lead came in that was in charge of working with the community, they kind of realized the situation and were pretty sympathetic, but they ran into some issues working with the contracting officer and an inability to influence the end outcome of how the project was implemented. And so when the project got to implementation, it really was pushed off later and later into the fall due to wet conditions, and it was bumping up against a window of time in which the community was set to host a big ski race. So a lot of the design elements that were most important to the community, and specifically the repair of the skid trails, didn't happen. And that led to significant financial costs to the community because they had to go out and initially repair the skid trails themselves, which wasn't part of the contract. And it was basically, it ended up being a significant failure and degraded relationships and longstanding relationships around this recreation area immediately adjacent to a community. All good intentions in terms of reducing the fuels, but the end outcome from a social and economic perspective was not a good one. So in the Northeast, with the Shamokin Nicolet, this was a small stewardship agreement, and the end outcomes and the objectives were mainly economic and specifically supporting local industry, as well as keeping the agreement holder, which is the county, keeping the county's natural resource staff employed throughout the year. And so this project developed over time, and it was based on long-standing relationships between the county natural resource staff and the Forest Service. They're co-located in the same district office. They've had many conversations over the years, but they never really implemented projects together. And then the county, one individual identified, hey, maybe we can use stewardship agreement mechanisms as a way to work together, and I can keep my people employed and I can help the timber industry. And this is a very poor area, so all of those things were very important. And in this project, the Forest Service, it was the first stewardship agreement that they had done as well. It was sort of a learning process, and we have observed this in a number of agreements, but in this one in particular, the agency really was treating the project more like a stewardship contract rather than a stewardship agreement. So that had some effect on the relationships as the project unfolded. And specifically, there was one instance where the agreement holder said, we believe that there's better material and a better way to do this boardwalk. It's going to cost less, we'll get it done quicker, and it will be more in keeping with the work that we've done in the county for decades. And the agency basically said, no, that's not in the scope, you're not going to do it. So that's an instance where really it was more contractual relationship rather than an agreement. I will say though, overall, this has been a positive project. They have looked to new agreements, and they're going to be doing more projects in the future. And the last project on the Kisatchie in Louisiana, I think this project above probably the others that we talked about is just a great example of the type of innovation that can occur with stewardship contracting. It's an IRTC paired with an agreement, and initially that timber contract was focused on thinning and stand improvements in longleaf ecosystem. So it's really a restoration project as well. A lot of the projects itself with stewardship are longleaf focused. In this instance, though, the agreement is a mechanism that the partners are using to help recover an imperiled snake, probably one of the most, if not the most, endangered reptile in the Southeast, although it's currently not listed. So in this instance, receipts that are actually being used to purchase snakes from a captive breeding program. And the purchase is occurring as a payment rate necessary to trigger investment by partners into the breeding program that will enable the reintroduction of the snake on the forest. So that breeding program had been in zoos throughout the region for a number of years, and basically what it needed was to become more focused and more effective and efficient, and this agreement was the mechanism that enabled them to do that. In fact, one of the partners defined the whole purpose of the agreement as, quote, establishing a new self-sustaining population of Louisiana pine snake in restored habitat on the national forest. So a part of this is to get the captive population large enough to reach its ultimate goal. So very much not traditional in terms of what we think of when we think of stewardship contracts and agreements. And when the project started off, it was really just one person within the Forest Service that said, hey, I've got a great idea. I'm going to run this up the chain of command to make sure that this is all consistent with policy of the agency and with stewardship authorities. I've observed people purchasing longleaf seedlings, and that being a significant component of a lot of agreements. Can I do this with the snake? And they worked it out with the regional stewardship coordinator and went right up to the regional forester, and it was approved. And I will also point out that, it's a learning process for everyone involved. When the agency rep who had never actually done a stewardship agreement before, when they took this to the partners said, well, I don't know, that seems too good to be true, kind of thing. So they worked it out over time, and now they have a program.
Okay, we want to wrap this up with getting some input from you all about these results. So we have a little exit poll, a few questions. First question. Oh, here we go. So do the case study observations that we've reported resonate with your knowledge and experience with stewardship contracting? Please select one of these answers. Okay, so for the most part, at least a few of these observations from this year's case studies resonate. In fact, most or many, the majority of you say most or many resonate with you. Second question, in your experience, how do non-agency stakeholders most often participate? It's based on your experience with stewardship contracting. Please select one. Okay. So providing comments, still the most common, but 27% say planning and implementation and 23% bringing resources into the project funding or capacity. And as just to reiterate, we saw quite a few projects this year where external partners, non-agency stakeholders brought capacity into the project. Next question. In your experience, which factor is most important for promoting quality relationships between agency and non-agency stakeholders? Please select one. Looks like this group thinks open and transparent communication is the most important, followed by early involvement by non-agency stakeholders. If you recall, the data from this year suggests that non-agency participants think early involvement, they would flip those two, but they're still both very important. And the final question is, based on your experience, what factor can most readily degrade relationships? Please select one. And clearly, the majority think it's poor communication and lack of transparency. And although in this year's case studies, we also saw unwillingness to compromise in contracts, and delays due to contracts as being quite significant in some projects. Brian, you want to wrap it up?
Yeah, I guess we may have 1 or 2 seconds to take a question or two. If people want to type into the chat pod, if they have any burning questions, we can try to address them now related to these case studies, or if you want to follow up over email, that is the other option as well. But take a look at your chat pod and see if we can answer a couple questions. And just note also on this last slide here, that's the link to the report. The web page, about halfway down, you'll see the 2017 report. So just wait a couple seconds, see if we get any questions. If not, I'm not seeing anyone typing questions, so we give it just 1 more minute.
There's one question in there. When you analyze these data, do you break out Forest Service agency participants and non-agency participants? I wonder whether and how perceptions and opinions differed between those groups.
Maureen, do you want to take a first crack at that?
Yes, we do separate them out. I think for the purpose of today's presentation, we can lump them together. But if you look at the report, you'll see that we do separate out non-agency and agency. There tend to be some differences in some projects. Brian, do you have a specific example, top of your head?
No, I will say though that not that it necessarily comes to mind. I will say that in the last few years, this question about early engagement and involving people at the very early stages, or as one participant describes, the very early kernel of an idea. You know, that's both something that agency, Forest Service people, and non-agency people recognize. Whether or not that happens, you know, that's the question. So it's not necessarily a universally held belief, but we definitely see it coming through more and more year to year that across the board people are saying early involvement is the most important.
I think of one other example where there's a difference is in the perception of project success. Agency folks tend to be more optimistic, positive about project success, unqualified project success than the non-agency folks. Tend to be more nuanced about it. But if you look at the report, there are many more examples, and over the years as well.
Any other questions, Alex?
We have a few. How do tribes respond to working with the Forest Service?
So I can lead off, I guess, with, and Maureen, please jump in too, but you know, in the last few years, we have looked at detailed case studies involving tribes. And this year, I think we looked at 2 projects that had tribal involvement, one of which the tribe holds a stewardship agreement. And, you know, it just varies from case to case largely. I think in this instance, on the project this year, the tribe had worked with an individual on the national forest for a long, long time. It was a long-standing relationship, you know, decades. And I think that sort of established a common basis of work and understanding. that agency person, although reflects that some of the newer people on the district don't have that kind of long-standing background and experience working with the tribe, they don't understand a lot of what has transpired over time, a lot of the fence mending that the agency rep had done, and there's not the same level of knowledge and respect. At least that's what the agency person communicated to us. The other thing I'll note is that on that project, as that relationship between the Forest Service and the tribe transitioned into implementation, it sort of reestablished each other's capacities. And you had the tribe working in partnership with a few nonprofits and, a couple scientists to basically define the type of restoration forestry that they want to see happen across national forests within, on their ancestral tribal lands. And they were using this project as a way to both see that vision happen on the ground and take a commanding role in that by actually doing the timber contracting and administration, doing a lot of the prep work and layout, and getting engaged in the monitoring work. So I think that's a concrete example about those sorts of working relationships. I mean, Maureen, do you want to reflect on this question too?
Yeah, I just want to add that I don't remember which of the tribal projects this was this year, but both the agency person and the non-agency participants indicated that the relationships had improved because of the acknowledgement on the part of agencies people of the tribe's historic relationships with that land, even though it was now national forest. So I think again, oh, go ahead, Alex.
I was going to move on to another question, unless you had another thought.
No, that's okay. Go ahead.
Okay. I'm going to combine a couple of questions on the nuts and bolts of how stewardship contracting works. What is the difference between stewardship contracts and stewardship agreements? How do you know which one to use? And if retained receipts must be spent on restoration, how is restoration defined?
Yeah, okay. So the basic difference between an agreement and a contract is the agreement is structured between two parties, the Forest Service and the agreement holder. It doesn't behold anyone to anything in a sort of a contractual way. What it does is it'll establish a master stewardship agreement to cross some specified geography that could be a national forest or spanning an entire Forest Service region. And then it identifies areas of mutual benefit and mutual interest to the agreement holder and the Forest Service, and sort of establishes in sort of an MOU type of way how people are going to work together. And then underneath that master stewardship agreement, there are subsequent supplemental project agreements that are negotiated and defined that spell out, basically programs of work, whether that's timber-related work, as you would see in a typical integrated resource timber contract, or service activities such as restoration actions, other than yeah. So that's kind of a quick and dirty on stewardship agreements. Integrated resource timber contracts and integrated resource service contracts are the two contracting mechanisms that fall underneath the bucket of stewardship contracts. So typically, if there's commercial timber involved in the project, it would be an IRTC, integrated resource timber contract. If it's purely a service-oriented project, so there's no net product value coming out of it, it would be an integrated resource service contract. And I'd refer you to the regional stewardship contracting coordinators for the Forest Service for, I guess, some more detailed explanation about, when people should select certain mechanisms and how they happen. But the big one is with an agreement, if there's a partner in the area that has specific skills or expertise and capacity that can improve the ability of the Forest Service to get work done on the ground, and relationships for that matter, then that's probably a pretty useful way to go. And that seems to be where a lot of the agreements come from. So if we have any more burning questions, we can answer them now or we can wrap up.
One more interesting one from a community stakeholder. You mentioned that agency and non-agency stakeholders have different definitions of success on some projects. What are the success measurements for the agency?
I need to clarify. They tend to be more optimistic about the success. There's a tendency for the non-agency stakeholders to say, to qualify the success, well, we're not really close enough, we're really not deep enough into it to know, I'm waiting to see if this happens, if that happens. The agency folks have a tendency to be more optimistic and say, yes, the project is a success. You want to add to that, Brian? Yeah,
I would say, the metrics by which agency personnel's performance is measured, there's a set of performance metrics for line officers and field staff. And if agency staff are able to get work done on the ground, that's typically how success is measured. Although I will say, with agreements, if the agreement includes a strong timber component, that agreement, even if it's 10 years in length, and if there's a supplemental project agreement underneath the master agreement that specifies a certain volume of timber that may or may not be harvested for multiple years, that the Forest Service can count that as an accomplishment when that supplemental project agreement is initiated. So they can count that towards their timber targets.
Right,
and that's the only nuance thing.
Yeah, that is. And something I don't think I heard you talk about this, Brian. This whole timing issue is a different concern. The several projects this year, the agency person was concerned that because the timber work happened and there was a lull for various reasons, relationships, etc., before the restoration work or the stewardship work occurred, they felt a little under threat that they might lose that money before they could get the restoration work done. And there were 2 projects this year where that came up, which is kind of a new thing.
Yep, that was definitely a new thing. And we did also observe instances where people that came to the table with the expectation of seeing the stewardship work done, they don't go away and they want to see that work done. And so if there is a lapse in timing, that can affect relationships, and it did in a couple projects. Okay, well, thank you so much for everybody that attended our webinar today. Feel free to reach out to me. There's my contact information below. And if you are interested in learning more about this project, please download the report. Give us a call, and best of luck to everyone. Thank you so much for attending.
Bye, everyone. Thanks.